Are you a critical thinker? Are you trying to be rational and skeptical and unbiased? Good work then, because this is neither pleasant nor easy, and today we will talk about the reasons for that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and I welcome you to another Soft Skill talk, this time about critical thinking. This was a wish from a viewer of the German channel, a talk about critical thinking, and I wondered, what should I discuss there? What is interesting about critical thinking? Now, critical thinking is popular, of course. I've never seen anyone who said, "Oh, I decided against critical thinking, I don't like it." No, everybody wants to be a critical thinker, but often people actually fail at doing so. Why is that? If critical thinking is so great, why don't we all always use it? The reason is simple. Critical thinking is not easy and it is no fun. And today we will find out why that is. I found a nice definition in Wikipedia where it said critical thinking means to be rational, skeptical, and unbiased. And we will have a look at those three aspects, starting with rational. If I am rational, I have to subordinate my feelings and my opinions to the facts, to objective truth. This means I am no longer the supreme ruler in my own head, and you notice this is clearly a disadvantage. Let's take an example. I do like to eat meat. Most of my favorite dishes contain at least some meat. However, I also know that the consumption of meat is a big driver towards climate change. And I know that in meat production, animals are treated in a quite unpleasant way that we don't really want to support. So in my head, I end up with a cognitive dissonance because my wishes and my knowledge of the facts, they don't go along very well, they don't match. And if I stick to critical thinking, I can't dissolve this cognitive dissonance. I can't get rid of it because I have to accept the facts. And I can't easily change my feelings. Without critical thinking, it would be much easier. I could just say, I like meat and that's okay because I say so. Or I could just avoid the topic and say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that topic. I don't want to know anything about climate change or about the treatment of animals. I don't know anything. Or I could just say, nice variation of that, oh, there are things that are more important. Which is clearly something I say to myself, because if I really wouldn't care about the topic, I would ignore it. However, it is clearly important to me in some way. I just wish it wasn't there. And of course, it's a slippery slope. If I leave the shores of rationality, I can set sail and proceed to the most creative ideas, such as, oh, this whole climate change thing is probably a scam anyway, or, oh, the animals probably don't mind, or whatever. So you see, rationality is important to help us be anchored and to stick to rationality, to stick to the real world. However, being rational is quite tedious and it is no fun. Next, we are supposed to be skeptical, to not just believe everything we hear. Now, this sounds good, but do you know what a hassle this is? Let's say I read a funny article. Chocolate is good against cancer. Usually I would just say, haha, funny, and move on. But now I would have to say, wait a moment, how do they actually know this? And then I would have to look up the study the article is based on. The study probably isn't free, but it costs me 30 to 40 bucks. And it is probably very boring and very complicated. I probably need to have studied statistics to even understand it. And the authors refer to 3 other studies that are just as expensive and as boring. And after lots of work and expenses, I finally arrive at a conclusion that is something like, we don't know for sure, but there are plenty of hints for whatever. Yeah, great. Now, obviously, I can't do this all the time, but that means that my life is full of uncertainty, because every time I encounter some piece of information, every time someone tells me something, I'd have to say, oh well, this sounds reasonable, but I haven't checked in detail, so some room for doubt remains. I'm not quite sure about this, and everything is uncertain. And we don't like that. We want to be certain about things. We want our life to be full of certainties, not full of vagueness. Now, of course, we don't want people to be too gullible, especially nowadays, where people end up having ideas like, oh, this nice guy on YouTube isn't a doctor, hasn't studied medicine, doesn't have any qualifications, but I like him. So I will now get my medical advice from him instead of a real doctor. Now, we certainly don't want that, but being skeptical is a big challenge, and it certainly isn't easy, it certainly isn't fun. Finally, we are supposed to be unbiased, and that one at least should be easy, shouldn't it? No, unfortunately, it isn't. We might believe that being unbiased merely means not to be consciously biased, that being biased is something we consciously do, and if we don't do it, we end up unbiased. However, just the opposite is the case. Our mind, our thoughts work in a certain way where they take a lot of shortcuts. And often those shortcuts work out fine, but sometimes we arrive at conclusions that aren't rational, that aren't logic. Often biases and fallacies occur, so there are mistakes in the way we think. So we are biased by default, and being unbiased is something we need to consciously do, because those biases and fallacies that frequently occur will distort our view of the world, and they will lead us to wrong decisions. Earlier, we had to subordinate our opinions and our feelings to facts and to objective truth. Now we even have to subordinate our perception and our memories. Let's say I've read a horoscope, and oh, this fitted me so well. They described me perfectly. This description of my zodiac sign, it was exactly me. No, actually I just encountered the Barnum effect. My perception was fooled. Or let's say I have a memory. I was sick and I took some homeopathic medicine and I got better. The homeopathic medicine healed me. No, it did not. I merely encountered the placebo effect, probably in combination with other things like confirmation bias, false attribution of causality, and silent evidence. But the thing is, my perception was wrong. My memories are wrong. And this is quite difficult to accept. The world is full of people who want to take advantage of us. There are plenty of marketing people who want to sell us things we don't even need. There are plenty of politicians who want us to vote for them. My boss might fake to be respectful and friendly because he thinks I will work harder and whatnot. And with all of this, we can't even trust our own perception and our own memories? Now this is difficult to swallow. And it doesn't get any better, because all of those biases and fallacies will still occur even if we know how they work. Understanding how they work will not cure us of them, we will still make them. So all we can do is to obtain knowledge of them, to consciously be aware of situations where certain biases and fallacies might occur, and then say, oh, this is a situation where the confirmation bias, for example, might occur, and then consciously work against it. So again, being unbiased is hard work, and it is certainly no fun. Let's say we want to stick to critical thinking nonetheless. We understand how important it is, and despite all the hassle, we want to do it. How can we get better at it? Well, I think one good piece of advice is to consciously distinguish between your wishes and your opinions and the facts. To distinguish between what you want to be true and what you know to be true, because often those two don't match. And we don't have to like the facts, but we have to accept the facts. Another thing I find important, even though it rarely appears in articles and discussions, is to question your own priorities, to question your own focus, to pay attention how much focus and energy and attention you put into a certain topic, into a certain discussion. This is a phenomenon I noticed. I only have examples from Germany. I'm sorry about that. I noticed a couple of years ago in Germany during the refugee crisis. There were a lot of refugees coming to Germany, and there was a lot of discussion about the costs. Isn't it too expensive? Won't it put too much pressure onto our social security systems? Oh, the cost. A lot of attention, a lot of fuss about it. A few years later, there was a scandal because bankers and the like had used a trick, a scheme to evade taxes and to actually steal money from the state, to steal tax money. The money all of us pay, we earn with our hard work, money that could have been used to fund schools or to be invested into infrastructure and whatnot. Total, it was about 30 billion euro that were stolen. And pretty much nobody cared about that. Another example I encountered just a few days ago, when the corona vaccines were introduced in Germany, and the situation was probably similar in your country. A lot of people were worried about those mRNA vaccines, and they said, oh, can't they damage or change my genetic makeup? Can they harm my DNA? And in fact, they can't. However, people were still worried about that. Now, a few days ago, I read an interesting article. A German organization called Foodwatch had done some testing of food products, and they had found residue of mineral oil in plenty of them. The important term here is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, substances that are suspected of causing cancer, and substances that can actually damage your genetic makeup and your DNA. Now, this organization has done those tests for the third time already, and they found those residues every time, but nobody ever cared, so nothing ever changed. I think you get my point. So pay attention to your focus. And finally, last but not least, we should recall what we learned from Karl Popper. I think we discussed him in the video about induction, deduction, and so on. Popper said that a proper scientific thesis always needs to be falsifiable. So, at least in theory, there needs to be a possibility to prove it wrong. So, if we transfer this idea to our own thinking, we should always, if we are heavily invested in a discussion, in a topic, whatever, we should always ask ourselves, what would make me change my point of view? And if the answer is nothing, then we don't have a theory, but we merely have an opinion or a belief. Because a proper scientific thesis or thought is marked by being our current state of knowledge, and always being preliminary in some way. And if there is new information, if new facts are discovered, we always need to adapt our point of view, our position, to match those new facts. And we might end up having to say, oh well, the other side was right and I was wrong, because the facts I based my position on are now no longer valid. So, what is the conclusion today? Critical thinking isn't something we do just for fun. Usually, what we actually want is just to be right. And critical thinking is merely used to legitimize our point of view. Critical thinking is quite important, but it is certainly not easy. Critical thinking means that we set very high standards for ourselves, and it's perfectly normal that we won't always live up to those standards. We also have to keep in mind that critical thinking isn't the only challenge in our lives. Ethical behavior would also be nice, or integrity. So, we shouldn't be too hard on those who fail at critical thinking, who end up with irrational positions. And we should be aware that critical thinking can't be forced. This is a waste of time and effort. However, we should also draw a clear line, because opinions, wishes, and beliefs are not the same thing as facts and should never be treated as such. By the way, you should be especially skeptical of people who want something from you, such as likes or a subscription to the channel. But I would still be quite happy about those. If you enjoyed this video, you might also be interested in the video Can You Trust Me?, where we talk a bit about how to find out if sources are reliable and how to deal with different kinds of sources. I will link to it in the video description. We will see each other again next week with another exciting topic. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.